All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, Warriors and board members. We're back with the War Room to the Boardroom podcast. I'm your host, as always, Mayshawn Wilson, a strategy and ops lead here at Google, Duke MBA, West Point grad, and also fellow combat veteran. Our mission here is to bring you diverse veteran stories packed with lessons on leadership, designed to help you overall excel in your career. Leadership, we bridge the gap between military service and the civilian sector, whether that's corporate America, public service, or entrepreneurship. You can follow us on Spotify, LinkedIn, or across our social media platforms. Today, we have an amazing guest who embodies the theme of adaptive leadership, Mr. David E. White, who is the 14th Deputy Director of the Peace Corps, confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate. His journey spans leading soldiers as a cavalry officer in Afghanistan, earning the Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Combat Action Badge, to the halls of Harvard Law and the high-stakes environment at a top law firm in New York, Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen Katz. On to advising presidential campaigns, serving in critical roles in both the White House and State Department, including facilitating Operation Allies Welcome. And now he's helping to lead a variety of different initiatives in his current role. So without further delay, Mr. White, please welcome yourself to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Mayshawn. It's fantastic to be here. I don't think folks necessarily know, but you and I go back almost 15 years. You're like family. So it's great to see you and great to be here. And you've had amazing guests. So I feel like I'm in terrific company, from Heist Gibson to Jerry Vernado to Mike Burns to Adrian Perkins. So many of my good friends, colleagues, mentors, and classmates. So great to be with you today and really looking forward to this.
It's definitely a small universe. I remember back when you were a cow on the cadet counseling unit during Beast, my cadet basic training. So it has been quite some time indeed. So David, can you talk about your incredible path? You know, it's very unique. You touched a lot of different sectors. You've gone from kind of military leadership to elite academic institutions to corporate law to high-level policy and federal agency management. Can we, as we unpack some of those leadership lessons of how you thrived in such different environments, I think that would be really helpful for our listeners to understand how leadership transcends different titles and industries and how you kind of incorporate those core principles and adaptability to continuing to grow into those new roles. And so to start off, can you tell us a bit about who you are and kind of how you came to West Point in the military?
Yeah, certainly. So, I'm third generation military veteran. So, service to others just was imprinted in my family's DNA. My father was in the Army for a bit. Several aunts and uncles were in the Army as well. I had a grandparent who was in the Navy. It's just been something that I knew from a young age that I was going to continue that legacy of service. And as you know, my brother Dan is a West Point grad, class of 2012, and also served. So long lineage of service in our family, and one that I'm incredibly proud of. West Point's also my hometown school. So I grew up about 45 minutes away from West Point, going to Army football games during the fall, going to summertime jazz concerts, watching the cadets parade. And I knew from a young age, I was just drawn to West Point. And I felt like if I was going to be fortunate enough to be able to attend one day, I knew that it was going to be an important part of kind of my own career. And so I kind of hit the lottery and I made it into West Point. And it's pretty competitive, as you can imagine, particularly in the local community, because it's not only America's Academy, but also, like I noted, my hometown college. And so it was fantastic because 45 minutes away meant that my parents could visit, but it also meant that, it was a guarded campus with gates, so my mom or dad couldn't just show up anytime. So it was fantastic. I actually went to West Point because I thought I wanted to be an ER physician. I was initially intending to go to medical school, patch people coming off the battlefield up, patching them up and getting them back into service. And then you could say that I kind of got bit by the leadership bug once I got to West Point, chose to major in sociology. I had some incredible mentors and colleagues that really invested in me, guys like Heist Gibson, Irving Smith, so many others. And I recognized that although I could do a lot of good in the world as a doctor, I wanted to have an even larger impact in leading organizations and having a career in public service. And so that's really what motivated me during that time I was at West Point. And there was also two wars going on, right? We had the war in Afghanistan, we had the war in Iraq. I was a freshman in high school when the Twin Towers fell, just about 50 miles away from where I was going to high school. And that only deepened my desire to serve. And so when I showed up on West Point's campus and I kind of decided what I wanted to do next, I knew I wanted to lead troops in combat. And so I decided to branch into the armor branch and ended up as a cavalry officer and leading troops in combat in Afghanistan. And that has been, without a doubt, just the highest privilege of my career, being able to lead troops in Afghanistan. So that's kind of how I came to be, son of the Hudson Valley, in the shadow of West Point already. And so it all worked out that that's where I got my start.
And can you elaborate a little bit more? So kind of this leadership force in combat. I believe you served as a Scout Platoon Leader in Kandahar during that time. Can you talk about how that experience kind of changed your understanding of leadership and decision-making under pressure?
Absolutely. So I came out of that experience kind of having a leadership philosophy that I think is rested on courage, conviction, and clarity as I think about kind of these different experiences I've had along the way. So first off, when it comes to courage, it's not just brawn or this idea of courage under fire in the physical sense. Look, I've been there too. I've been shot at, blown up, all of that. Those are not the best days of my life, but rather, the opposite. And I was very lucky that all of my soldiers were able to make it home. And as we say in the military profession, right, it's better to be lucky than good, but I've been fortunate to be both, in large part because of the people that I served with. When it comes to courage, it's really about acting before you have all the information, especially during times of crisis, when action is required, when you need to be decisive, being decisive when it counts, and then not second guessing that decision, but executing on it. And that's so important. And whether that was preparing my unit in a counterattack that fortunately never needed to materialize after we were struck by an IED in Kandahar, or whether that was leading the Peace Corps, as we would have multiple air medevacs going on at any given time for a volunteer in South America or Africa or somewhere in Europe. And it's important to be able to act with as much information that you have reasonably available to you, but not to wait too long that it gets in the way of making the right decision and doing it on a timely basis. So I would leave you with, when it comes to courage, courage is not bravado. It's really choosing values-aligned action when risk and ambiguity is high. Secondly, when it comes to conviction, it's really about navigating and leading with a moral compass. So when I was over in Afghanistan, I required all of my soldiers to carry a pocket-sized copy of the U.S. Constitution. It went in on the right shoulder, right under that American flag patch. And I sourced copies of the Constitution myself before we deployed, handed them out to all of my soldiers, and required that they wear them. And you might be asking, well, why? What's the significance of that? Of course, and all of us as soldiers know the significance of the Constitution to a military member. But it was really this larger idea that if we were going to lose one of our buddies out there, why were we doing that? Was it simply because we wore the uniform and we had been called to serve? That's part of it. Was it, because we were selflessly serving Afghans who wanted an opportunity to take their country back from an insurgency? Yeah, that's also part of it. But I think for me, the bigger part was that we were protecting and defending the US Constitution and ensuring that folks understand that deep level of conviction by physically being required to carry that on them at any given time. I think that helped to tell people, look, you don't even have to agree with this war or why we're over here or your opinion of how the war is going or whatnot, but you're here serving and protecting the US Constitution. And so I think that's really important. And leaders have to articulate and defend their values under pressure, whether that's organizational pressure, cultural pressure, outside forces. When you don't lead with that conviction, it leads to mission drift. And we all know what happens when we start to drift away from our values, from our mission. We end up in a pretty sticky spot. And then lastly, to round it out, clarity. That's something that I've always thought about as I'm leading. And that really comes down to something that one of my colleagues and good friends, Heis Gibson, talked about recently in a Harvard Business School podcast, where he talked about commander's intent and breaking that down into also task and purpose and being very clear about what success is, how do you define success, and then how do you hold people accountable to meet that success, and being outcome oriented, being very clear about your expectations. And so at the end of the day, for me, it's been about courage, conviction, and clarity.
Do you feel like as you've kind of pivoted, do you feel like those have stayed pretty consistent even across kind of different organizations? that have, of course, different missions, different values, whether it's kind of at Wachtell or within the State Department or other organizations that you've been a part of?
Absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely correct. I think as a leader, the constant needs to be your leadership philosophy. You are moving through all of these different contexts and background and cultures you're stepping into, but your true north has to be the same. You can't sacrifice your morals or your values or your character, or your integrity, based on kind of the arena in which you're doing business or going to war or so forth. So I have found personally, transitioning from the battlefield to being a law student, to then being a clerk on a federal appeals court, to then being on Wall Street at one of the top firms and doing billion-dollar M&A, all the way through my several roles in government. My leadership philosophy, while always being honed, has been substantially the same. It's been kind of grounded in this idea of courage, conviction, and clarity. And that looks different in the different industries, of course, right? But to give an example, perhaps, if we're early on in our careers and we're still in the Army, and we're talking about being on deployment, let's talk about clarity. What does mission success look like when you're leading a combat unit in Afghanistan? What's the commander's intent look like from your company commander or your troop commander? And really articulating how you're getting at that mission and how you can measure your success. So that may look different than if you're representing a client who's about to go through or is hoping to complete transformational M&A, or a client who has some big stakes bet the company type litigation. But you still need to be sure that you're acting with courage, knowing that the market will likely, hopefully, love this deal and the shareholders will vote in favor of it. But you also are not going to have perfect information, right? You're not going to have all of the votes locked up, no matter how much time you have, no matter how long that roadshow is. And similarly, when it comes to conviction and being clear about what motivates you to do the right thing, to add value in whatever industry you're in, I think those things are consistent and constant across.
Can you talk about, I guess, your decision to decide to transition from kind of that military, that defense policy space into Harvard Law, kind of following some of your injuries in combat? Can you talk about kind of what led to that decision, both at the Warrior Transition Unit and ultimately where we reconnected in West Point admissions?
Yeah, certainly. So, I was struck by an IED. It was a suicide bomber who was on a motorcycle when I was leading a combat patrol. We were on foot. And I was very fortunate that I walked out of there with a broken arm. So I've got a whole erector set in my right arm, but I've been in great shape. And about 3 of my guys were wounded as well, and they've all made good recoveries. So it was a good day, even though it was obviously a terrible incident that occurred, a terrible attack by an insurgent. But, as I was laying up in the hospital, I had my family and some friends checking on me. I had a lot of time to think. I had a lot of time to think about what comes next. I knew that I wasn't quite yet finished with the military. I wanted to make sure that I was investing in that next generation. And so the opportunity to serve as an outreach officer at the Department of the Directorate of Admissions at West Point was really important to me. And making sure folks that look like us had opportunities to serve in America's Academy, hugely important to me. And so I got to do that work with Betty Murthel and Mike Burns, Tasha Sproul, and others across the Midwest and Great Lakes region, as well as kind of the Northeast too. And that was really great. And that allowed me that kind of time to reflect as well about what came next for me. And as I was reflecting, I was thinking about the different career paths that could be open to me. And I had a lot of great mentors, friends, colleagues, classmates that I consulted along the way, the kitchen cabinet, so to speak. And I was starting to think about it. And I said, well, I even thought about being a doctor at one point. I said, well, I went to West Point to be a doctor. I kind of led troops in combat, and somebody else patched me up coming off the battlefield. Do I want to do that? And I said, it's still a noble calling, but I don't think that's where I'm going to be able to do the most good, right? I said, okay, scratch that off my list. And I said, what about going and getting an MBA? And I was really interested in doing that. And I said, okay, that's interesting. And I said, but I'm also kind of interested in law. And I like the kind of greater opportunity in terms of being able to be a lawyer in addition to kind of doing business I had to offer. And then I started to look around and I saw, okay, who are the CEOs, the era when I was growing up, kind of that Obama era, if you will. The Lloyd Blankfeins, the Brian Moynahans, Dick Parsons, and so many others who were the luminaries, particularly in the corporate sector. And I realized a lot of those folks had just JDs. They had law degrees. They actually didn't have MBAs. Started to think about that. I said, well, that's interesting. I started to do research, started to dig in. And then I recognized also I wanted to have a career where I could have a mix of public service and private sector experience. And when it comes to the public service, it's really important to understand kind of law as the architecture behind policy, and also, frankly, behind a lot of the private sector work that happens as well, right? The norms and so forth. And so at the end of the day, I ultimately decided to pursue the law degree, applied to a bunch of schools, was fortunate to get into Harvard. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll do a JD MBA. And I went through my first semester of law school, and I was like, I'm pretty happy in the law school. This is going well. I can always go back for an MBA later. I think the idea of going to school for 4 years might have spooked me a little bit. And 3 years, frankly, was long enough. There's a debate among lawyers about how necessary that third year is. But it's always to our advantage that, there's 3 years in which to kind of do all the work that you got to do. And perhaps that's where the prestige of the law degree perhaps comes, is this idea of 3 years instead of 2. And so to boil it down to its essence, I recognize that if I wanted to have a truly rewarding and fulfilling career in public service, but to keep private sector opportunities on the table, a law degree would be a great opportunity to do that.
Well said. Can you talk about coming back into the classroom? How did you shift both those military experiences, one back into the classroom, but also from sociology into all that comes with law school and different regulations, rules, precedents, cases, all of those fun things?
Yeah, certainly. So, I remember it very well, although it was more than several years ago now that I was a first-year law student. I remember at the end of the first semester, I got my grades back. And at first I was like, oh, okay. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. I just passed my first semester at Harvard Law School. And then I said, that's cause for celebration. And I was really excited. And it was also an opportunity to see kind of what worked well and what I wanted to do differently. And in that second semester, I blew it out of the water. And then from thereafter, the vast majority of my grades were the equivalent of A or A pluses. Ended up graduating with honors. And that puts so many more options on the table in terms of being able to have my pick of opportunities to work with incredible judges and law firms and so many other things. But, it's humbling to go back to school after you've been in the military and had kind of some of that time out. And the way that I kind of described it is that I was 2 standard deviations older than the typical law student, right? By being 5 years out of undergrad. And there's this, in law in particular, there's this idea of what they call K through JD, not so common in business school, but where folks go from kindergarten all the way through up to a JD and actually never have true working experience outside of an internship. They don't work a job. And I think we both know, like, when it comes to growth as a leader, you need both knowledge and experience. It's about them coming together that really provides for that growth. And I saw that my classmates that were the most successful lawyers tended to be those that had a little bit of experience, prior to going to law school, were able to leverage that experience as they were thinking through the knowledge that they were picking up, and then really putting that to work when they got out the other side of that law school experience and representing their clients. And so I kind of joked that I was 2 standard deviations older than the average student in the classroom, but I certainly wasn't the oldest at the same time. And I think for me, it was interesting because I was 17 when I started West Point. So I was on the younger side. I was one of the youngest at the academy when I showed up in our day. But I think it's about humbling yourself, recognizing why you're there, and then really setting goals on how you want to finish out your time. I remember, for instance, and maybe this will be helpful to some people, but I remember I was thinking about, my career at law school and how I wanted to finish up. And my goal was to graduate with honors. There were 2 other, and there's kind of 3 categories of folks graduating with honors at the law school. One is summa cum laude, first in their class, so just one person. And then there's magna cum laude, which is like another tranche of folks. And then there's cum laude, basically like that other bucket of with honors. And I said to myself, look, if I'm really going to enjoy this experience, have a kind of fulfilling, rewarding time not just in the classroom, but out in the community, getting to know my classmates and all of that. What does success look like for me? And being able to articulate that. And I wrote it down when I was a 1L, and it was graduate with honors. And that's what I did. Because I kind of thought about, well, if I wanted to graduate magna, that was going to take away from some of the other experiences that I was going to have. And so I was able to balance it, like starting my own record label and music publishing company when I was in law school, right? For example, being able to get out of the Cambridge bubble and go into Boston and work with community members and really understand kind of the area in which I lived, going out to sporting events, making friends outside of the law school, all of those different things. And I was really glad the way that it kind of rounded my experience. But I think one of the key ingredients in my success was not just being older, but leveraging the perspective or the wisdom, and I hesitate to even call it that at that young age, but being able to leverage that perspective that it's not just about the experience in the classroom, but also recognizing that if you want to have the best opportunities on the table, you've got to do a little better than average.
So you've balanced, what are my priorities? How can I get the full cumulative developmental experience while I'm in law school? And then also have impact on the community and overall broader Boston area. If I got that right.
Yeah, that's right. There's a joke in the legal community, and folks who get A's in law schools become professors. Those that get B's become judges, and those that get C's become lawyers. So, I always thought that was perhaps a little bit exaggerated, but there's some kernel of truth maybe in there somewhere.
Kind of like the Robert Kiyosaki book, right? Why C students run the world? Something like that.
Yeah.
To kind of pivot back to law school a little bit. So you mentioned kind of that intersection between policy and law. Can you talk about how M&A law fits into that versus picking another type of law, whether it's being a litigator or maybe it's patent law that may nest a bit more succinctly with government and policy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I really had kind of three component pursuits, if you will, when I was in law school. And one was my legal studies at the law school, which kind of spanned kind of business policy and the law, but kind of doing that at the law school and then doing something similar at the business school. So I was over at the business school taking classes like on financial statements, value analysis, business classes, right? And then I was also at the Kennedy School of Government, and I was taking courses on public policy, on Congress, and different things. I was thinking about these three component parts as kind of being the law school, the business school, and the School of Government at the Kennedy School, and how to have overlapping education as it relates to government and kind of policy, legal education and understanding the law, and then also business and recognizing that the private sector by large is the largest, and in many ways you could say is a key driver of what makes America so great today, our economy. And so I was thinking about all of this and thinking about how to have a well-rounded education coming out of law school. Overarching idea too was really chasing down what justice means and looking at that through different lenses and recognizing that it's an elusive concept to really put your finger on, and it looks different in a number of different contexts. So as I was thinking about kind of what I want to do coming out of law school, pretty early on, I had the opportunity to secure a clerkship, and I thought that that would be an interesting opportunity that would broaden my perspective and horizons as it related to the law. And a lot of people, I think rightfully so, talk about their clerkship as the best opportunity to influence law, maybe over their entire career, because you work closely with a judge who's the one deciding cases. And judges do this work and rely heavily on law clerks who do a lot of the research, the writing, the provide analysis, and so much more. And at the end of the day, it's the judge's mandate to make great decisions. And they're doing that in kind of their own stead, but with a lot of help from law clerks. So the ability to make a mark on that law and to deliver just a little bit more justice, I was really proud to find a great mentor and judge in Paul Watford, who's on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And we got to do some of that work together, me under his tutelage. And then I was thinking about, okay, what comes next, right? Where am I headed thereafter? And recognizing that I was going to be kind of getting a crash course in business by being an M&A lawyer. And my specialty was restructuring and finance. So restructuring, a fancy word to really mean bankruptcy, but in the corporate context, working with distressed companies. I think in many respects, that was not something that was on my radar before. I thought I was going to do more general corporate kind of M&A work, but I loved working with distressed companies. I loved it because it was as close as you could get to going to war and kind of this high stakes, time ticking down, resources ticking down drama that comes with being a restructuring lawyer. Loved it. Representing both borrowers and representing creditors. It was a fantastic crash course in business. And it allowed me to get more into the numbers. And then I complemented that. And the other half of my practice was as a finance attorney. So doing all things related to debt, from origination, so helping a borrower who's either high yield or an investment grade borrower to get the funds that they need in order to complete a really important transaction, or like during COVID, where cash was in short supply, and there was that dash for cash, as it kind of became known in the industry, ensuring that the banks weren't let off the hook as our clients needed money and helping them to draw down on those facilities. And then being able to do a little bit of pro bono practice too. I remember being able to represent an artist who was working with a gallery and making sure that she got a great deal and so much else. So I was really approaching law school with this idea of wanting to get a well-rounded education that in many respects you could say probably was reminiscent of my West Point experience, right? Going to an engineering school, having an engineering sequence, at West Point, mine was systems engineering and I really loved it, but also having a major in sociology, but then having all of that physical and military development piece too.
That's helpful. It's good context in terms of the different nuances that you learn in kind of navigating M&A and kind of its relevance to policy and how business and the economic drive engine of the U.S. kind of operates. Can you talk about kind of one, how that pivot happened in terms of, you're doing law, it's usually very tempting to stay in this path of associate to senior associate to become a partner. What made you decide to come and step back into federal service for the Biden-Harris administration?
Yeah, for me, it was really one thing, January 6th. So I had been an advisor to Kamala Harris's campaign and then moved over to Joe Biden's campaign thereafter and really enjoyed the experience with both. On Vice President Harris's campaign, was working on veterans and military family issues. And so the vice president was way ahead of her time in thinking about how to restructure different kinds of discharges, because we saw an uptick in the number of bad conduct discharges happening among service members, which meant that they were being denied all kinds of benefits to include healthcare. There were, you saw the military kind of relying on different characters of discharge. And this is a time of war. People were suffering from PTSD and other ailments. The vice president recognized very early on the need to ensure that veterans who left the military got their benefits. And so I was able to work on some of that really important work. And then working with President Biden's campaign, got to focus more on trade and economics and really appreciated that opportunity. And then after that happened and you kind of switched to the gear of getting out the vote, and then I got a phone call on the day that President Biden was announced the winner of the election. It was a Saturday. I got a phone call and said, "Hey, we'd love for you to join the transition team." And I said, "Well, I'd be honored, be happy to. I mean, this is really important work." And I was thinking to myself, this is great. I'll do the transition team for the 3 months that it is, from kind of November to January. You get about 75 or so days to really set up the president and vice president to enter office. And then I'll go back to my law practice. And that's the way things were moving. And I was thinking I'll catch the Biden administration in the second term. That was kind of in the back of my mind. This kind of was my plan. And so I really enjoyed the transition experience. And specifically, my role was vetting cabinet level officials who the president was interested in bringing onto the administration. And that work was very fulfilling, really enjoyed it, and thought that it was important to ensure that President Biden and Vice President Harris were able to kind of have a running start when they got into office. Because the first thing you want to be able to do is translate a lot of those campaign promises to real action, right? Policy wins and so forth. And people are policy. The person who's in the chair really depends who's sitting in the chair in order to give you the policy you need. And so being able to work on that was really rewarding. So then I thought I'd go back to the practice of law and, like I said, catch it in a second term. And January 6th happened. And I had a couple offers outstanding from the administration, one to go into the White House, another to go to an agency. I wasn't sure. I was a little bit on the fence, but January 6th showed to me that nothing was more important than safeguarding the Constitution, ensuring that checks and balances were being done, putting this country back together as we were still trying to get through COVID, difficult economic times, justice issues that were always so important, but even more important at that moment. And so I looked to my wife, then girlfriend, and I said, look, I think I've got to go back. We had a good life in New York, but I said, I think I've got to go back. And I met with the chair of the restructuring and finance group. His name's Ricky Mason, and he's now the chair-elect of the Boy Scouts parent organization, Scouting USA. And I told Ricky kind of my conundrum in a way, my dilemma, so to speak. And I said, look, I really love it here at the firm. I think I've got to go back because I think the stakes are just different now. And Ricky looked me in the eye. He said, look, you don't have a choice. You're going back into service. The president's asked you to go, you go. There's no higher calling. We'll be here whenever you're finished. And that was it. I was notified on a Friday that I was going to start work on a Monday. The firm was incredibly helpful and gracious about the whole thing. And I would tell folks who are listening, a key to that was my transparency and open communication. So making sure that my colleagues, the partners I was working with, understood kind of how things were in flux for me, how I could be getting a call, what I had decided, so that the firm could move quickly to support me. And the firm was so supportive throughout. So then I ended up at the White House. I was doing similar work that I was doing on the transition team. And I was working alongside really committed Americans who believed deeply in the country's promise and what we could do together in that presidency. Some of these folks were relatively junior. Some were still in law school. Others had just graduated. And I was one of the more senior attorneys, and I was in a very junior position as basically a line vetting attorney. And a lot of people don't know this, but I was also in kind of a temporary position that was funded only through the rest of the fiscal year. So I had a job from basically when I started about 3 weeks into the administration until September 30th. And a lot of people said to me a couple things. Number one, you're way overqualified to be doing that work. And what I told them was, look, it's not about qualifications or if I'm too good for something. If they need me to sweep the floor, mop the floor, take out the trash, whatever is needed to help get this country back on track, that's what I'll do. And I recognize that me working in the Office of Presidential Personnel, ensuring that we were getting the right folks who were resonating with the president's priorities and values, that's what I needed to be doing, without regard to whether or not I was overqualified. And the second piece of that, where folks were like, you're putting a lot at risk. I said, look, I'm not the typical risk-averse lawyer. This is a moment in which my country needs me. I could always go back to doing a number of different things, but this is where I'm needed most. And that was a tremendous experience. And it taught me the importance of putting your ego to the side and just getting in where you fit in and focusing on the work. When we were withdrawing from Afghanistan, I was asked to go up to the National Security Council and work on the resettlement of upwards of 100,000 Afghans in the United States. And so that was really a 3-phase operation, moving our Afghan allies out of Afghanistan to a third-party country where they underwent screening and vetting to ensure that we were only letting good people in. And then they would end up in kind of that second phase on one of 8 different military bases in the United States. And that's where we were ensuring that they had access to resources, preparing for a resettlement in one of hundreds of American communities. And then that third phase was actually resettlement. And I learned a ton there. And that was a really fantastic stretch assignment, having to make a lot of policy decisions, having to do a lot of interagency work. And that was, as is typical when the National Security Council at the White House takes over a really thorny issue. Once you're headed in the right direction, once you've kind of started to execute on what's necessary, you then turn it over to a lead federal agency. So then I was asked to go back and lead one of the teams in the Office of Presidential Personnel at the White House, the National Security and Foreign Policy team. And I wasn't sure I was qualified to do that, but they told me, look, we don't care much about what you think you're qualified to do, or even honestly what you're interested in doing. This is where the president wants you. And that's why having a heart for service is a great thing. And I said, look, if this is what you want me to do, I'm honored to do it. And I tell folks I've made a career out of saying yes. And so that was my third job in just under a year in the administration, and an incredible opportunity. And I was appointed as a special assistant to the president. Was very honored to have his trust and confidence to execute on his behalf. And it was a fantastic opportunity that set me up well to go on to be the number two of a federal agency.
Lots to unpack there. So one, kind of your conversation at the firm to kind of make that pivot and having the right mentor and I guess performance and relationship to make that happen. And then two, kind of your openness to whatever the assignment could be. Curious as well, can you talk a little about, I guess, how they go about picking some of these positions, right? Is there different tiers in terms of, if you work the phone banks in the campaign versus, if you're a top tier donor? Can you talk about kind of that piece a little behind the scenes of how that works for someone that may want to get involved in a campaign, but is not necessarily sure kind of how that shakes out and what happens?
Yeah, I'll do my best to give a quick overview. That's really the subject of a whole nother podcast, which I'm happy to do at some point, Mayshawn. But let's talk about the basics a little bit. So when someone is running to be president of the United States, that starts with really a campaign, and a campaign of different planks that create a policy platform of kind of what that president's going to do that's going to make the lives of Americans better and really benefit the whole world. And as leader of the free world, the president also has an obligation to taking care of humanity, I believe. So, that could look like everything from tax policy to addressing climate shocks to industrial policy, social issues, so many other things. So when it came to President Biden's campaign, he was very focused on social justice, the economy, and putting COVID in the rearview mirror. Those were really like his three main points. And he and the vice president were extraordinarily focused on this. And then once you win, you have that transition the transition period, which lasts somewhere between 70 and 80 days, depending on how the calendar falls. Most experts tell you need 90 days to really get up to speed. I mean, think about for a moment, you get even less than that to be the leader of the free world. And during that transition, the president and vice president are getting daily briefings, really hourly briefings. They're consuming a bunch of briefing materials so they can hit the ground running. They're building these teams. They're really building the plane while it's flying. And of course, the transition team actually kind of starts to take shape months in advance of someone being declared a winner in the presidential election. But it really kind of turns on in earnest right after that person's been declared a winner. And then you shift into kind of governing mode once you've won, once you take the oath of office. And the president then has to figure out, okay, how do I translate a lot of these lofty, ambitious goals into real change that affects the American people in the world, right? How do I actually start to end COVID, right? How do we get more shots in arms, for example, is what the president was focused on. How do we repair some of the damage that had been done to our alliances? How do we make sure the economy is back on track in a sustainable way? How do we deliver wins when it comes to social justice and equity in our country? A lot of really important issues. And there's two essentially groups of people that support the president in his or her work. The first group are a whole cadre of incredible, selfless servants who have worked in government from anywhere from 5 or so years to 30 or 40 years. These are your career civil servants, people who have served through many different presidential administrations. They are really the heart and soul of our government, the folks who make sure the trains run on time. If you think about a ship under power heading in a certain direction, they're the ones that keep the ship under power. They're a deep reservoir of institutional knowledge and expertise. You then also have 4,000 political appointees who parachute in on day one or over the first 100 days or so. And if we go back to kind of our ship at sea, these are the appointees. These appointees are responsible for making sure that the ship is sailing in the right direction, consistent with the president's priorities and values. And these folks also, importantly, serve at the pleasure of the president, which means as the president changes, they're out of a job. Which is why I left the Peace Corps on January 20th. And you need both groups to really ensure that the federal government is being run in a way that respects our great history and the mandate that the U.S. government has. but is also responsive to the voters and is ushering in an era of progress that the American voters voted for. And so if we zoom in on those 4,000 political appointees, you'll really come away with kind of four levels of appointees. To start, you have what are called Schedule C appointees. You have somewhere around 12 to 1,500 of these, and these are junior, mid, and senior level appointees who are usually in special assistant, senior advisor, kind of chief of staff type roles, doing really important work. And these folks range from being fresh off the campaign to having 20, 30 years experience. And then you have your non-career senior executive service, which are your deputy assistant secretary and equivalent style positions. So like my brother Dan, he was deputy assistant secretary at the Department of Homeland Security, where he was kind of DHS's chief strategy officer after serving as the deputy chief of staff to the Secretary of the Army. So Dan made that jump from being Schedule C to being a non-career senior executive service. There's several hundred of these folks, but because a big part of that role involves leadership and institutional knowledge and expertise, you want to be careful that not too many of these are political, so they're capped. And it's generally capped at around 10% of overall senior executive service folks, can't be political. So only about 10% or so are political. The next phase are presidential appointees, distinct from political appointees in the sense that the president himself or herself actually appoints these people to the office that they hold. A great example of this would be the deputy administrator of the Transportation Security Administration. We had a great one during the Biden-Harris administration. This person was appointed actually by the president to fill that role. That role, like other presidential appointments, does not require Senate confirmation. So it's great. You can get to work right away. And then kind of that final category, and there's probably a few hundred of those, the final category of folks are presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed. So this kind of works in that sphere of our checks and balances and the constitutional right that the Senate has to advise and consent on the president's cabinet and other important senior officials. So this was the category that I fell into as the number 2 at the Peace Corps, the deputy director. And there's 1,200 positions that kind of are at that level. And those range from assistant secretary all the way up through cabinet secretary. And so it really requires all of these people who are political appointees, kind of those 4 different buckets of folks, working hand in glove with the incredible civil servants that serve across all of the different departments and agency to really make a difference in the lives of everyday Americans. And to the second part of your question around kind of, well, who are these people that serve as political appointees in an administration? They are a mix of folks who come from all across America, but typically have served in a previous presidential administration, may have worked on a previous presidential campaign, have worked on the Hill, so in Congress, either in the Senate or in the House, who are subject matter experts, perhaps coming from academia, number of folks coming from industry as well. And so it's a really diverse group of people who are coming together. And when I was working in the Office of Presidential Personnel, we used to talk about how our mandate was to build an administration that looks like America. And that's what we did.
A lot of amazing work and accomplishments, and I appreciate you kind of sharing that overview for listeners, especially who aren't familiar with how that process works. So I guess the top question then at this point is, what's next? Like you touched a little bit of it all, from kind of music to big law to different echelons of higher policy beyond in the strategic and policy development stage. What is next in your career?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. Of course, it's something that I'm thinking a lot about. I've been blessed recently. I've got a newborn son, not so much of a newborn anymore. Now he's going to be 10 months next week. But I've been a stay-at-home dad for the last few months since I left the administration. And I've had a lot of jobs, but this one takes the cake. This has just been an incredible opportunity to spend so much time with my son and really be there as he's making those first memories, having so many firsts, from just beginning to crawl to trying all kinds of new foods to taking leisurely walks and going to the park, just so important. And it was really important for me to take that time Kind of like I alluded to earlier in our conversation, as I was laying in the hospital bed after being wounded in Afghanistan, I was thinking about, well, what comes next? And this time has really been helpful to not only care for my son, but also think about how I can best contribute to society. You know my family well, and so it won't surprise you when I tell you that, when we said our prayers every night, one of the last things that we said was, help me to make this world a better place. I've always thought about that because I say it now with my son at the end of the prayers, help me to make this world a better place. So what does that look like in kind of a next chapter? And the answer is, I don't know, but I've made a career out of saying yes. And I know that there are excellent opportunities out there to lead values and purpose-driven organizations toward really ambitious and audacious goals. And I'm really excited to do that in this next stage of my development as a leader. I'm excited to see what that looks like, and only time will tell.
And now a culminating exercise, if you will. How do you kind of raise and develop the next generation, given those 18 years of instruction, and see kind of how they blossom kind of beyond the walls? So we've talked a lot about leadership. We've talked about transitions. We've talked about navigating policy and law. What books would you recommend, say, for someone that wants to pursue your path, whether that's public service, whether that's, debating kind of their next path in or out of the military? Are there any books that come top of mind to kind of navigate that or were helpful for you in your journey?
It's a really good question. I mean, there are a ton of books that I could recommend, but maybe I'll give kind of more targeted advice in the sense that it depends on what you want to do. One of the really great things about books, which is similar to getting coffee with someone in a sense, is there's so much vicarious learning you can do. You can learn from other people's experience. So I would encourage your listeners to think about what kind of their next steps might start to look like, what arena they want to step into, and then to take a look and see who's best in class and who's written about that, and then starting to read up on that and understand it. So for me, as I was thinking about government service, I was reading a ton of autobiographies and biographies, everything from Winston Churchill to Susan Rice to Samantha Power to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I mean, I was reading it all. If I get my hands on it, I'd read it. And the point was to kind of bring all of these data points together and discover for myself what that through line is and what success looked for all of them and what it means to me. I think I've taken different things from each of these leaders kind of when it comes to my career in government. One of the things that I take from Susan Rice is preparation. She's incredibly committed to preparing for all of her meetings, no matter how important, and most of them are very important. And that's really important because you got to respect people's time and this idea that we're all equals, we just have different responsibilities. So every night that I was deputy director of the Peace Corps, I'd go home with a briefing book in hand and read through all my materials to be sure that I was prepared for the next day of meetings. From President Biden, I think I really took away compassion and empathy for your fellow man and woman and what it means to really care about people that you're leading. I think from Samantha Power, I thought much about what it means to have conviction and the idea of a moral compass and really being true to self. And, I go on and on about leadership lessons learned from Colin Powell, from reading through a lot of his work. And I've also read across the political spectrum and ideology and from different parties too, because I don't think anyone has a monopoly on great leadership. And so I've read a lot of different things that I think have been super helpful. When it comes to the business community, it's the same thing. I read a number of biographies and different books that kind of allow me to learn about different leaders who have come before. And that's been super helpful. And so I would encourage people to read a really wide variety. And I think I'd also encourage folks to not get caught in this trap of reading just books about one demographic of person. And so what I've tried to be really intentional about is reading books by women who are leaders in business and government. And probably over the last few years, I've read more books by women authors than I've read books by men authors. And I think in large part, that's to overcome a natural bias I had coming into this pursuit of understanding. And I've been able to correct it by kind of overweighting some of that. And when I was reading Indra Nouri's book, former chair and CEO of PepsiCo, I came away with some really great lessons around how to balance family and professional pursuits that, frankly, I wasn't reading a lot about in a lot of biographies written by men. And then as I approached taking my parental leave and taking these few months off and caring for my son on a full-time basis, support my wife and going back to her job as a university professor at Harvard, I was able to pull on some of Indra's background and thoughts on some of this for support. So I think you've got to really look at a wide range of information that's out there, and also people who have done it before you. There's a couple other books that I found very helpful. I think First 90 Days, great book. When I graduated from West Point, Rob Carpio actually gave me a copy of that book. And believe it or not, every time I start a new job, I open that book up. And I still go back to the edition that I got back in 2009. And I crack it open and I read through it. I find that it's a great opportunity for me to take a breath, think about how I want to approach this next position I'm going into, think about what success looks like, and then also recognize that I need to be adaptable in this new role that I'm going into, that my boss is a completely different person than it was before. The people I'm leading are completely different people before, but that I can still harness these 3 C's I talked about earlier: courage, conviction, and clarity in this new context.
That's very helpful. Well, David, you've given us this incredible insight. Your leadership journey has been incredible, from kind of adapting to different situations to having impact at federal policy levels, impacting major law firms that I think are very translatable for veterans across all sectors. And so for our listeners who kind of want to learn more about your work or connect, where should they look for you?
Yeah, best to find me on LinkedIn. That's kind of the only social media I do these days. But you can find me, I think it's D.E. White Jr., but if you just search David E. White Jr. or David White Peace Corps, will probably come right up. Would love to connect, learn more about your listeners' journeys, and be a resource to anyone who's making that transition from the military to leading in a civilian context.
I think that's all the time we have for today. Again, from the War Room to the Boardroom, a huge thanks to you to David E. White Jr. And remember to follow us on Spotify, LinkedIn, and Apple Podcasts.